In this screencast, we're going to look at examination technique for the SY3 paper, which is on understanding politics. So let's start by looking at time management, and the first thing to remember is, as we can see here, that this particular paper is an hour and a half in duration, so you've got 90 minutes to spend on this particular paper. And on this slide we can see the layout of the exam. So you've got a 15-mark question which you have to do, so this is a compulsory question. And then you get a longer essay question marked out of 45 raw marks, and you can see on this section there is a choice. So you do one of the 45-mark questions alongside this compulsory 15-mark question. Now, one thing to note is that when you open up your exam paper, you will also see some other topic areas on understanding crime and understanding health and disability. You just ignore those other topics. They're there because other teachers in other schools might have chose to teach those options for SY3 rather than the one that we focused on, which is understanding politics. So you just answer these questions, and to be honest, even looking at the other two sections is a waste of your precious time. Now, there are three broad areas that examination questions tend to be based upon. So firstly, you might get questions about the role of the nation state, and that might include the impact of devolution or globalization on the role of the state. Secondly, you might get a question about some form of political participation. So for example, you could get a question about voting behaviour, about the role of pressure groups or the role of political parties, or the role of social movements. And that might include the impact of new technologies on social movements. So for example, the impact of the internet and wireless communications. And then finally, and this is the most common topic area that tends to come up, are questions about the distribution of power. And particularly important here is learning some of the theoretical perspectives that we've looked at, particularly pluralism, Marxism and elite theory. Now, unfortunately, time management is not as straightforward as it was at AS level, where it was simply a minute a mark. So on this paper you've got 90 minutes, but you've got 60 raw marks. You've got your 15-mark question, and then you do one of the 45-mark questions. So that works out as a minute and a half a mark. So if we work out the timings precisely, that means that you've got 22.5 minutes for the 15-mark question, and then you've got 67.5 minutes for the 45-mark question. My advice is that as a bare minimum, you spend at least 20 minutes on the 15-mark question, and as an absolute maximum, you spend no more than 30 minutes on this section of the exam. And then that leaves you with at least an hour, and possibly a bit more than an hour, to do the 45-mark question. And that gives you plenty of time to really think about the question and do a really good plan before you start writing. So let's start by looking at the compulsory 15-mark question, the mini essay question that you have to do in the SY3 exam. Normally this question will ask you to outline and explain a key concept or theory from the specification. So in your first paragraph you need to define that key term, that key concept or theory that is used in the question. And if you think the meaning of the term is open to different interpretations, then also briefly mention that in your first paragraph. And then in the rest of your answer, you need to try and make 4 to 5 relevant points that are connected to the key concept or theory that is mentioned in the question. And for each paragraph that you write, you need to clearly identify a point, explain that point in a bit more detail, and try to link your explanation to relevant examples or sociological evidence, so for example a key writer or study, and obviously make sure that each point is clearly linked to the concept or theory that's mentioned in the question. So that's the pattern that you need to follow for this particular part of the exam. And this is similar to the peel paragraph approach that we practiced in class, but without the need to evaluate your point. So this is a descriptive answer, but if you've got time and you can also think of some evaluative points, then you're not going to be penalised for doing that. So the 15-mark question is normally going to ask you to outline and explain a key term that's used in the specification. And what we can see on this slide are all of the key terms that the specification uses. So these terms are to do with the role of the nation state, and this term, agencies of social control, refers to the police, the judiciary, the court system, in other words those bits of the state that are about enforcing the law. The bureaucracy refers to the administration of the state, and that refers to the role of the civil service. So the civil service are the administrators who help the politicians to govern the country. And a bureaucracy is an organisation that is based on the principle of legal rational authority. Devolution, remember, refers in a UK context to the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh, Northern Ireland and London Assemblies, and that might be referred to also as regionalism or federalism. This term that you might not have come across before, secularism, refers to a political system where there's a complete separation between the state and organised religion. So countries like France and the United States of America, there's a strict separation between the state and the church. The UK is not based on this particular principle. The UK has as its head of state the Queen, and the Queen is also the head of the Church of England, and within the House of Lords the leaders of the Church of England also sit, so they're also part of the legislature. So we're not strictly based on secularism. The opposite of secularism would be a theocracy. So theocracy is where the state is actually controlled by religious leaders. These are key concepts to do with political participation, and this term, social resistance, is just examiner jargon for political protest. Radicalism at the left is Marxism, and radicalism at the right would be right-wing extremist political parties. So those political parties that are based on a view of nationalism that excludes certain groups on the basis of their race, culture or ethnicity. And new technologies, as we mentioned earlier, is about the internet and wireless communications, and then these are the key theories that you need to learn. And as we can see on this slide, these key terms, the way in which the spec is laid out, matches quite closely the types of past examination questions that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we're going to end this screencast by looking at examination technique for the longer question, the 45-mark question. And with this question, it isn't just about your knowledge, it's also about evaluation. So in this question, you've got to engage in a critical discussion and debate, and the skill of evaluation is signposted by the use of command words such as discuss, to what extent, assess or evaluate on this section of the exam. Now there are 3 types of 45-mark questions, each of which requires a slightly different structure. So you get questions that ask you to evaluate a claim, questions that get you to evaluate one particular theory, and then questions that ask you to evaluate sociological explanations, and all that means is evaluate a range of theories. So for questions that ask you to evaluate a claim, I think it's useful to use this four-part essay structure. So you need to write an introduction where you decode the claim in the question, and then you need to look at both the arguments and evidence that support the claim, but also the arguments and evidence against the claim. And the most common mistake that students make with this type of question is they only look at arguments that support the claim. Whereas if you're being asked to assess or evaluate a view, it's important to look at the arguments against as well. And then you need to write your conclusion. Now, the easiest way of making sure that you get a really high mark for this type of question is to make sure that in sections 2 and 3 of your essay, so the main body of your essay, that most of your paragraphs are based on this pill approach, where you clearly make a point, you explain that point, you link it to relevant examples and sociological evidence, you link it explicitly to the question, and you also include some explicit evaluation. So maybe at the end of the paragraph you use the word however, and you identify maybe a specific criticism that somebody might make of the evidence that you presented. So one way of visualizing this particular essay structure is to imagine an X-ray picture of a fish, and the head represents the need to write an introduction. The two sets of bones is a reminder that you've got to look at arguments both for and against the claim. The spine is a reminder that within each paragraph there needs to be a sentence that links your evidence, links your argument back to the question, and the tail is a reminder to write a conclusion. And what you can see on this slide are examples of the types of questions that are asking you to evaluate a sociological claim. And quite often these questions will ask you to assess a particular view. The second type of 45-mark question that you might get on your examination paper is a question that asks you to evaluate a particular theory. So you might get a question, for example, that asks you to evaluate the Marxist view of power. And for this type of question, I recommend a 5-part essay structure. So again, there's a need always to write an introduction. Then you need to describe the main characteristics of the theory. Then you need to provide some examples of studies or key writers that we would associate with the theory in the question. And then you need to evaluate the theory in detail. In other words, you need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the theory that is mentioned in the question. And to maximize your chance of getting a high grade, this particular part of the essay needs to be the longest. And the most common mistake that students make with this type of question is they spend a lot of time describing the main characteristics of the theory, and then they rush the evaluation section. The key skill here is evaluation. Make sure that you give yourself plenty of time to look explicitly at the strengths and weaknesses of the theory. And what you can see on this slide are examples of this type of essay question where you're asked to evaluate a particular theory such as pluralism, elite theory or Marxism. The third and final type of 45-mark question that you might get is a question that asks you to evaluate sociological explanations. And this means evaluating not just one theory, but evaluating a range of theoretical explanations. So with this question, this is the kind of structure that I would recommend. So an introduction, and then let's say the question was evaluate sociological explanations of the distribution of power. You might initially look at the pluralist perspective, identify the main arguments that theory makes about power, look at the evidence which appears to support that view, but then because the command word is going to be assess or evaluate, you also need to identify the main arguments and evidence that criticises that particular perspective. So this bit is really important. Then you need to move on to another explanation. So you might look at the Marxist perspective, describe their main arguments, look at evidence that supports that theory, and then look at the criticisms. And then if you had time, you could move on to look at elite theory and follow the same kind of pattern before drawing a conclusion about which explanation you think is the most credible. And on this slide we can see a couple of examples of the types of questions that follow this particular pattern. So for all three types of essay structures, you need to start with a clear introduction, and on this slide you can see some sentences that you could use to help you write your introductory paragraph. And also it's really important that you round off your answer with an effective conclusion. And again on this slide we can see a template that you could use to help you write an effective conclusion paragraph.